Hey everyone, welcome back to the Wealth Preservation Podcast. We are excited about today's episode. But first, as always, I'm here with Josh Saunders. Josh, how's it going?
Hey everybody, how's it going? We're excited to be here. Bringing you another great episode about entrepreneurship and business, and we'll probably run down some rabbit holes that are very random, but we have an awesome guest today. Mark, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest?
Yes, we have Caylan from Label Live. Caylan, how are you?
Hey, very good. Thank you. Good morning.
Morning. Yes. Caylan, real quick, can you give us a brief breakdown before we go into today's episode? I just want to give everyone a brief breakdown of, where you're located, your business, and I know you do something, incredibly intricate, right? And very, your product can do a lot of stuff. But can you give us a brief overview of Label Live and the general area that you work in?
Yeah, you bet. So I'm out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, a few hours away down the Mississippi River in a lovely town called Winona, Minnesota. And I am a solo developer, solo entrepreneur that a few years ago created an application that runs on Mac and Windows that lets people design labels for their label printers. And so the way I look at it is it's basically software that lets you utilize like a miniature printing press. And as archaic as that sounds, I think it's important that kind of we draw that distinction that this isn't an inkjet or laser printer that prints big pages. It's these little teeny labels, and there are just so many gotchas with printing labels on label printers.
Yeah. And we'll dive into this, but I was introduced to you via my brother who uses your guys' products, and I was unaware of the archaic system. And it is one of those funny things where like a mom and pop shop might be like, oh yeah, we do this. One stumbling block we did not think we'd have is this is incredibly old and ancient, the way that we're labeling things and keeping track of orders in the POS system. And so we're really excited to see how you innovated in that arena. But before we dive into that, we always want to know a little bit more about who's behind the company, right? And so we want to get a little better idea of you. So going back to kind of early years. So when you were young kid, were you more entrepreneurially minded? Were you thinking, hey, when I grow up, I want to disrupt the label making industry?
Yeah. So what's really interesting about this is when I look back and reflect, it wasn't until my 30s that I had kind of a realization that entrepreneurship is kind of what I was diagnosed with, right? And so some people look back, or your parents look back, and they say, "Oh, son, we didn't have ADHD back in our day. We just got through it, and all this stuff." And so the diagnosis, when I say that, it's because what I considered normal was just kind of like not quite normal. So, sure, kids take apart things, they build things, they blow up things, they try to invent things, and that was definitely me. But there was also like an extreme puzzle solving tendency where if there was something that was just a little bit off, I would try to figure out how to make it smoother or work better. And later in life, I think that has helped me to some degree, minus like not having any patience for things that don't work.
That's probably the
Whether,
big part right there.
it's always so. Even at a young age, there was that level of kind of nerdiness. What I think defined kind of my childhood was that my grandparents ran concession stands at the Minnesota State Fair, and it was root beer and popcorn, caramel apples, caramel corn, chocolate covered frozen bananas. I still have all the pricing memorized. And so ever since I could stand up and see above the counter, I was handing product to customers. I was asking, how can I help you? I was making change as soon as I could count and helping my father early in the morning, stock the concession stands. And so I always wondered how both my parents, who led very lower middle class, basically like retail management jobs, would take basically all of their vacation time for the year and spend it on about 15 days at the Minnesota State Fairgrounds. And they made a little bit of money. It was better than what they were making at their normal jobs. But it was just kind of this thing where they owned it and ran it. And it was mostly my father and my father's side of the family. But I really attribute that as kind of a big piece of my ability to communicate with customers and talk to them about their problems. So it's like, oh, I'm sorry, you didn't have enough butter on your popcorn. Let me just like squirt that, right on top. Too salty. Let me make another batch. It was just always helping the customer. And I think some of my favorite memories, when I was 12 or 13, it was learning the other side of customer service when they were like, let me talk to the manager. And I'm like, I am the manager, and it's like, oh no. so we would have, those kinds of things at the Minnesota State Fair. Into my teen years, I did more consulting once I finally got into computers. I remember my parents, they had a Commodore 64. So I was probably 4 or 5 years old. I was born in '83, so maybe this was like the late '80s, early '90s. And I remember that my uncle would bring the 5 1/4 inch floppy disks, and he would send them to us from, I think, Alabama. And I haven't confirmed the story, but either him or someone he knew operated under an alias that would crack arcade games and port them to the Commodore 64. And so I would receive these kind of boxes of disks, and I knew how to put the disk in and type in load star.star run or whatever it was, and then I had a joystick and I would play these flight simulator games back on this old computer system, and I just loved the idea of what this thing did. And I remember having like a book that had some basic programming in it, or whatever language was on the Commodore at the time, and I would type it in, and I was very disinterested. Like, I just didn't get it. I didn't understand what it could do, and I really didn't have any mentorship to kind of help me navigate what computer programming or software development could be, even in that. So the environment was ripe, but I had no guidance, which really frustrated me. And it wasn't until a few years later, maybe when I was 7 or 8, that we moved into a new house into the suburbs. And I went downstairs and there was a box of additional business software. And I said, what is this stuff? And they were like, oh, this is like the stuff that came with the computer. It has like it was called like Geos or Geo. And it was an operating system that was like a graphical desktop. And I thought, I mean, I was so upset at my parents for keeping this from me, because I felt like that was where I could have really enjoyed like how a computer worked. And so I kind of never forgave them for that. But then years later, I ended up buying like a 286 or a 386 from my uncle, and learning, and finally a 486, and installing Windows. But at a very young age, I would say 14 years old, I was running Linux on old 486s and early Pentium machines. So Linux supplanted DOS. And then through the funds that I would earn at the Minnesota State Fair, I bought the G3 iMac that came out, the Bondi Blue, about 2 weeks after it debuted. And that pretty much solidified like me as someone who could work for something and then buy a computer that was new. And so once I saved up all my money over that summer and bought that, I think it was $1,300. I mean, it was expensive. I think my parents went in half and I went in half, and had it for a year or so, and then ended up selling it and then buying a laptop that then I ran Linux on. And so between all those different things and consulting, I was building websites at the time, at probably 15 years old. And so I landed through just word of mouth. I built a website for like a model shipbuilder. I built a website for the local news anchor's fitness side hustle. I built different websites, and this is like just straight up HTML, static pages. And then a few years later, got into PHP. So I was probably 16 years old, and started building what ended up becoming a point of sale system for the concession stands at the Minnesota State Fair. And so this was, if you can kind of rewind time, it was like the year 2000 to 2002. And I had a touch screen that had a serial port on the back for the mouse, for the cursor. And then that went to a little server computer box that had, I can't even remember what it was running for hardware, but it was the smallest computer that I could find that would run Linux. And I had a USB cache drawer that I programmed a driver to fire open the cache drawer. And I built a full screen web app that was running on the LAMP stack, which, if you have any technical audience, it's Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. And so with that, I built a very simple point of sale system that had all of the products organized on a grid, and you would touch large popcorn, small root beer, $20 bill, and then it would tell you how much change to give back. And with that, and it had some rudimentary inventory management system built into it, where if my father plugged in a USB thumb drive that had the right password on it in a file, it would then dump all the sales data to it from the previous few days. And so that system was credited in saving the family business. I mean, it paid for itself within like 2 days because of just theft of money walking out the door.
Okay.
So between all these stories, and we can go into detail of any one of them, there's kind of a lineage of building things for fun, and not really for profit. I mean, it was more like, oh wow, you'll pay me to not deal drugs? That's great. Like, because I was gonna go deal drugs, and now you've given me this opportunity to like participate in society, which is a huge, I would say, of my friends at the time, it was really difficult. Like, I grew up in the Minneapolis suburbs, right? So this was Anoka, Minnesota. It was District 11, and in my late 20s, I ended up reading a New York Times article that talked about teen suicide, and I started reading it, and I was like, well, I had some friends that committed suicide when I was a young kid, and I started reading it, and I'm like, oh my God, this is about my school district. And it was like, oh my God, this is like from 10 years ago, looking at historical data where that was like the hotbed of teen suicide. And I thought, what in the hell? And so I'm reading through this and learning about the policies that adults made that put children in precarious situations of bullying that would lead to suicide, all revolving around different kinds of, like, you can't say gay, or kids could say like um, terrible words describing people, but the teachers weren't allowed to reprimand students because it wasn't deemed offensive. I mean, there are all these like gray areas of how this kind of bullying was institutionalized in the school district, and it made me realize that, like, I was lucky as hell to get out alive, because I suffered through, I mean, a lot of terrible bullying. I was maced as a 16-year-old, like in a parking lot of a Burger King, because some kids that were like white supremacists at the time, like, were bullying kids. It was terrible. Um, but then looking back and thinking, like, I'm glad I got out alive, and B, um, it wasn't our fault. Like, as kids, you're always like, oh, I'm getting, the getting beat up or made fun of because of like who I am. But at the time, it really helped to, in my 20s then, to think, oh my gosh, like, it really wasn't me. My mom and dad were right. Like, these kids are messed up. The system's messed up. And I just didn't believe my parents. I was like, no, this is definitely my fault. Like, it's my fault that I'm getting, made fun of. Um, and so it was just a real eye opener to have the world kind of exposed that adults could make mistakes and hurt children indirectly in that way, when they were trying their best to educate us, but at the same time it was creating an environment that was very hateful and hurtful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of a rundown of the entrepreneurial side, pre-college, you could say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that definitely. I'd love to hear what your parents have to say about, like, yeah, he was really mad that we didn't give him the computer operating system as a 7-year-old. And we're like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
we're terrible parents. And then I'm sure after you built all that, they're like, oh my gosh, we're terrible parents. Why didn't we give him the computer operating system when he was 6?
Why does Caylan keep asking for accounting software? It's all he wants is accounting software.
There
And
are
Caylan,
certain
please don't
things.
audit us.
Yeah. My parents were, we always had food on the table. But there was some struggle, and the struggle was either through illness. So my mom was really sick for a lot of years, and she ended up passing away when I was 16. And in that time, I was getting into trouble too, right? So I was kicked out of high school in my sophomore year for hacking computer systems, which basically, what it was they would turn off the security on all these Macs, and I would unplug the Ethernet cable or whatever it was at the time, and then they couldn't turn the security back on. So then I'd go in and disable the security, and so when I plugged it back in, my computer was kind of immune from having its security turned back on. And
wow, you're a violent criminal. Whoa,
just terrible. And so then they kicked me out of that class, and as kind of me being upset about it, I ended up making a website that doxed these teachers. And so it said where they lived and all these things. And this is before there was words to describe like what these things were, right? I definitely like regret and apologize that, but what ended up happening was the teachers felt unsafe. This was like 2 weeks before Columbine. Just to give you, I mean, there was no, this was not like palatable. Like there was no, people weren't afraid because of what happened. They were just like uncomfortable with me being in their rooms, which I totally get. What then they did is they said, well, Caylan, your parents have to come in tomorrow morning. I mean, they had the police involved and all this stuff. And so, and I refused to admit that it was my doing. These poor teachers, I mean, it's embarrassing. But what ended up happening was really interesting. And this like sets the stage for a lot of like how I escaped that district, that school district. So parents come in the next morning. My mom, of course, is like full blown chemotherapy. Like at that point, probably had less than a year to live. They're not up for a fight. They're just like, "What'd you do?" And I'm like, I kind of did this. Um, Meanwhile, being kind of a belligerent teen, like I didn't do anything wrong, you know. And so we go in there, and the principal slides a piece of paper across the table and says, "Here's a list of schools. Pick a different one, and we will grant you a voluntary transfer, and this won't be an expulsion." And I was like, "Oh, that's easy. Well, my girlfriend goes to this school, so I would like to go to that one, please."
Yeah.
And they were like, "Done." And they're like, "You can leave, and we'll send you, you know, the info in the mail or something." So I end up literally walking over the railroad tracks to another neighborhood, getting the school bus, and going to my girlfriend's high school, where I remember maybe like a couple hours worth of classroom. Like I have no memory of this, just through sheer stress, right, of like how this is going down. But then at the end of my sophomore year, I meet with a advisor, and she says, "Caylan, you're in the top third of your class." You know, I think I was probably like just made it. Like if you looked at all the names, I was like right at that line that she drew. It was like, "Caylan, you made it to the top third of your class. You're eligible for something called PSEO." And I was like, "Great, what's that?" And she said, "Well, it's post-secondary enrollment." And I said, "Okay, well, what's that?" And she said, "You get to go to a community college if you want." And I was like, "Okay, well, I don't know what that means, but that sounds better than what I'm doing now." So she gives me some material. She sends me home with it, and my parents say, "Yes, you're doing that." So I get my driver's license. I pick out my 4 or 5 classes, and for listeners that don't know, PSEO is basically they take your state funding for public schools and they route it into a community college system. And so all of your tuition and textbooks are paid for. You just have to get yourself there and get yourself home. So I start looking at this um, structure of what this means, and I'm like, wait, so I get to pick out all my classes? And they're like, yeah. And I was like, huh. And I'm like, and I can pick what time I want? And they're like, yeah. And I said, but I have like 3 hours of doing nothing in between these two. And they're like, find something to do. You can get a job, you can study, you can, I mean, what do you want to do? You know? And I was just like my whole world was like, there was so much stress relief because I wasn't in survival mode of being in a school system, that all of a sudden I was treated as an adult at 16 years old. I mean, I had my license, I had a serious girlfriend, um, you know, my mom was dying, and I like wanted to be an adult. So I was like leaving the nest. Um, and it was probably one of the most spectacular like realizations as a young adult, that I had a freedom to not just do what I wanted, but to participate. And I think that was one of the biggest things. So I start going to my first computer science course where we're like building linked lists and C++, and I have a other courses like math, algebra, soon to be like pre-calc, then calculus. And I was like, oh my God, I'm good at math. Like this whole time in the school district, I was like, I'm not good at this. Like I struggle. It makes me feel dumb. And then all of a sudden I had teachers who cared. And in 4 semesters, I was entering a 4-year college system taking Calc 2, right? And then Calc 3, and then discrete math, and got a math minor. And so it was a huge success. But I remember my second year at PSEO at Anoka Ramsey Community College, they had a tutoring program. And I was like, well, I don't really need tutoring. And they're like, no, Caylan, no, you should consider being a tutor. And I said, oh my God, yeah, I would love that. Like consulting, I get paid, I get to like, help people. And so I was tutoring adults, like legit like 20, 30, 40. I mean, I don't know how old they were because it's hard when you're 16. Everyone looks like they're a neck beard, gray haired person. And
During a
and
bunch
sure
of
enough,
60-year-olds.
Stop making fun of me. Stop making fun
and
of
I
me.
was
I'm
like,
not
no,
that
no, you
old.
just like, so I would help them with algebra, and it was a huge eye-opening experience to like both like humble, but also like make me feel like I had some worth in that community, and so that helped change my life. So a few months into my first semester, I'm in my computer science class. Phone rings. It's my dad. He's like, "You got to come home." So I knew that my mom was like really sick. She was in hospice, like not conscious anymore. And so then she passed away that day and came home, and like family's all there. And um, with that kind of happening at the same time, um, we the moral of the story, if anything, is like these kinds of difficult situations like they helped me define how I could be like going forward. And so for a lot of people, the deaths of family members, like there's a huge grieving cycle, and I went
Yeah.
to grief groups as a child to cope and deal with this. But I hope like through these experiences of like giving like an oral history of like how did Caylan end up like okay with this, or how did he survive? And I think like the biggest strength is like her death helped define who I could become at the end of
Yeah.
the day. So like those are just some of the tidbits from the late high school drama that unfolded that helped propel me into a 4-year college. So at the time, both my parents did not have college degrees, um, and then I ended up following my high school sweetheart to the University of North Dakota, which begins the next chapter of this
Yeah.
history of entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Well,
Do you have any questions before I keep going?
no, I really want to dive into the college career, but real quick, because you're touching on something that I think, it's not really entrepreneurial. It's more like, I guess like kind of parenting advice. There seems to be like, parents who want to keep bad things from happening to their kids, and parents who want their kids to grow up, toughen up, right? And both sets, kind of see the other one as reckless. But I mean, I guess what's kind of your take on like giving structured hardship, or allowing things to happen to kids, but also having that, not, I don't want to say safety net, but kind of there to, to not just be like, hey, you're on your own, because at 16, I mean, you took a lot on, right? There's some 16-year-olds who, if they go out and do that same thing, are going to fail miserably, and probably should be propped up a little bit. Right, I'm just curious about your insight, because you have a very unique story in that regard.
So I have an almost 5-year-old and an almost 2-year-old, and there's not a day that goes by where I'm like, how much should you struggle at 2 years old? Um, uh, I think that's a really dynamic thing, and it probably depends on the person. I don't think my parents knew how to answer that question either, right? And I don't think they did anything wrong or right. It was just the way that it went.
It was.
I think that simplifying something over the years and looking back on it, like smooths out a lot of the detail. Like there was a lot of stress of like me not, thinking that it reminds me of the beginning of a book. I tried to learn programming, and especially like Mac programming, like 6 or 7 times. I just like couldn't figure it out. I would quit. I would get, a month into some kind of project and be like, I don't know what I'm doing. I can't do this. And there was a book. It was written by a guy named Aaron Hill Glass, who founded a place called the Big Nerd Ranch. This is going to sound hilarious for non-technical people, but Aaron's like a bit of a like a tech hero in some ways, in a very like small niche. And Aaron, at the beginning of his book, he wrote something like, "Just remember, this stuff is really hard, and you're not stupid, and you just got to keep trying and keep trying." And I thought, like if we can normalize the discomfort of learning, that is the biggest thing that we can do to help people grow as a person. Because everything that I do, including like sitting down and having this podcast, is like a stressful event. right? But every time you do it, it gets a little bit easier and a little bit easier. Like, I'm not looking at the camera, I'm looking at my computer. Like, I'm going to look back at this video and think, you done messed up, Caylan. You should have been looking at the camera. But at the end of the day, I've got blue eyes. I know how to look at the camera, but it's easier for me to stare at my coffee. So.
Well, and you're probably nervous because Mark's kind of a jerk, and we already know that.
I'm a very, very intimidating guy at 5'8.5". So, I had that half inch.
One thing about that, I lost my train of thought, but there's so much wrapped up in failure and how that exposes people to stress. And I would just say that, like, the point of sale system never went anywhere, right? It just got shelved, and I probably have like a hard drive from it to like look back on in 20 years and be like, I wonder if this thing still spins up. Let's go look at my PHP code from 1999. Those are interesting, like, artifacts, and they helped build the next step. And so a lot of people will say, like, standing on the shoulders of giants is like what we do. And it might be standing on a house, a deck of cards, a house of cards where it's just about to collapse. And I have friends that are deeply, like, senior computer people, and they say it's a miracle anything works at all. Like, it's just an absolute miracle because this stuff is just all bubble gum and duct tape. But going back to that failure, I mean, it's when you stand on the shoulders of giants, you're also standing on your normalization of stress. And so as you become more comfortable doing things, whether that's meeting with a client for the first time or speaking at a public engagement, you end up like creating grooves that are like a record where you're like, I'm just going to say that thing again because it made people smile, and you're just like, and so what I like about this is, like, y'all haven't heard my stories before, so I get to, like, tell them all. And I know I'm going to, like, tomorrow, tonight I'm going to be like, oh, I didn't tell that story, we'll have to do it. But there's a lot to say. And I think that I'm 38 years old. It doesn't feel that old, but I can guarantee, like, every year that goes by, I'm like, that was a fun year. That was an exciting year. Had children or bought a house or moved to a new city or, lost a loved one. I mean, those are all monumental events. And I think in 10 years, it's going to feel the exact same way. And in 20 years, it's going to feel the exact same way. And I'm going to be sitting here saying, like, yep. Still stressful, but I'm smiling through it.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the normalization of failure, because that's probably like 5 episodes worth of topics right there. But first question, have you bought your kids any accounting software yet for their computers? I mean, that's the first question.
Yeah. Correcting the errors of your parents.
Yeah. Are you fixing that problem?
So there is certainly a desire for me to, like, see my kids perform like circus animals programming or doing logic. And I see online certain products advertised to me to help my children learn how to program. And I think this is, like, such a silly thing, because if I'm a good parent, like, I'm going to help them explore the things that they want to do, right? Like,
Sure.
like, what do you want to do? Like, self-selection in this area is, like, such an important thing. We haven't gotten to my business yet, but part of my hesitance and reluctance.
That's episode, like, 15. We got, like, hours before we get there.
But just to kind of tie it back to that, though, or to if I try to sell someone on a job that I want to create being exciting, I feel like I'm doing a disservice. What I would rather do is say, here's kind of what I'm thinking. Does this excite you? And most people are like, no, thanks. But hopefully 1 out of 100 will be like, that's what I want to do. That looks really cool. Like, right, I'm going to come in and, like, solve these puzzles with you and help in this, like, really bizarre, unsexy product niche where people are miserable, but we can, like, help them do that. So with kids and helping them learn, I mean, the resources are here, right? The computing infrastructure we can put together. We can do Raspberry Pis. We can do robotics. Like, I have a 3D printer that the kid just loves to pick out models to print, right? But I have almost no patience for 3D printing after, like, a year of struggling with it. That I'm like, we're not printing anything. Let's just. But again, like, the older like I love to tinker more with you end up burning out, and your curiosity um has a limit in some ways with
Sure.
certain technology, or the ways like there's only so many label printers that I want to unscrew and look inside before I'm like they're all the same.
Right.
And I think with a child, it's if you burden them too early with that excitement, it's just not exciting. It doesn't lead to the next thing. And so
Yeah.
instead, um, I'm kind of just waiting. So screen time is like very minimal in our house, which is kind of easier with a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, right? They're not like clamoring for any of the latest like Roblox or I'm just going to date myself. I don't know any of the things that kids love to do.
No, you
And
did pretty
so,
good with Roblox. I have a 12 and a 10-year-old, and that's you
yeah,
got it, man. That's a good one.
yeah. And so I'm just like, okay, Minecraft seems really cool, but like, oh, this is a big thing too. So growing up, all my friends love video games, right? They just like, it was started with Super Nintendo, PlayStation. At the time, there were
Sega.
other consoles that were like really interesting that only like rich kids had, like 3DO. Is that one of them?
Okay, yeah.
I mean, there was like weird ones. And my thing was like my parents had no disposable income for those kinds of like gaming systems, but I would go to their houses and I would watch them play. And they would say like, "Well, do you want to play it?" And I'd be like, it's fun, but I like watching you play." So I was like the Twitch is that the right, is that like people who
I,
stream video games? Like
Yes.
I lived as a kid watching my friends play video games, and I was like, "Great, I watched you play for 2 hours. I don't need to play." Now, with the exception, there was a game called Twisted Metal 2 for PlayStation that was amazing, like cooperative multiplayer. So like cooperative multiplayer, I was like, I'll do anything to play games with you. But when it was like competitive multiplayer, I was like, nah, you guys can play, I'll watch. And
yeah,
so
that's funny.
there was like a deep, like from a very young age, and whether or not that was like an insecurity that was there of like competing, but like I hated sports. Um, I was like anti-athletic up until like my mid 20s, where I learned how to like ride a road bike, and then I was like, oh, you can do sports by yourself. This is amazing, and then would just learn how to do that. Um, but yeah, as a kid, like I loved helping, and so even I look back and I think of other things that mimicked that environment, and like being a helper in a kitchen, like a sous chef. Like I love like some of my best jobs and gigs were like helping a chef like work through an evening's meal. Like so much fun.
Yeah,
They would ask, "Do you want to do this someday and be a chef?" And I'm like, "Nope." Like I have no desire to be a chef. But if you need help, you need me to save the day and like make you look really good. That's like I'm absolutely all about that.
sure.
So being in like the limelight, creating something wasn't necessarily a dream. It was more about the process of like getting people to that level where they could perform. And I think for some reason that's just always been kind of a whether it's like my partner in crime, like my wife, or um, other things, like I taking credit for it is just kind of an uncomfortable thing for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to go back to the first part of the podcast when you're talking about, creativity and kind of following, you know, whatever those whims are. And, you kind of had that creativity, but why do you think we are so bad in our current, for a lot of people, of squelching that creativity of kids are like, let them break stuff, let them figure stuff out. And we kind of squash that. Right. I mean, I know why I do it as a parent sometimes because it's inconvenient, right? Cause I'm like, gee, I got to clean up this kid's mess. But letting them fail and break and figure out, and but we definitely do that, and obviously that helped in your early development about loving to kind of just figure out how stuff worked and keep that curiosity going, and how do we do that better?
Yeah, so my 5-year-old, I'm guessing, will learn how to use a screwdriver pretty soon, and will want a giant assortment of things to take apart. It's just kind of a guess. He would really enjoy that. Um, so probably like going to Goodwill and like buying alarm clocks and stuff like that to bring home will be in our future, which I think to me is like sounds really fun. He I don't pretend to know anything about parenting other than to like I mean I hesitate to even say what I know. I know nothing.
Yeah,
Um, and so I am afraid deeply of those mistakes that I'll make. But hopefully they're just kind of going with the flow.
yeah,
I don't know. I don't have a good answer on what that creativity means. Like one thing that comes to mind that I do with my son is he wants to invent things. And so we make stuff out of cardboard and duct tape and like aluminum foil and markers. And
Yeah,
he's just like begging for that like every day. Like, can we invent something? Can we invent something? So he got some Ninja Turtle figurines and we're doing like a boat that they can like sit in that's like unsinkable. And I mean, it's just like, he has such an imagination and it's exhausting, and daycare and childcare in general from like 8 to 4:30 allows me to recharge my batteries, and then he comes home or we have the weekend and it's like I can be a great father that has that patience.
sure.
but
Yeah,
but gosh, I mean, what the pandemic the last couple of years has shown too is when you lose that ability and you're not adjusted to that level of like kids in your face all the time and not able to like have peace and quiet to do things like I'm doing now, it's really tough. It's like hugely challenging.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
it, so while you know we had our second child in May of 2020, so a few months after the pandemic started, we had home births for both of the children, um, which was mostly just like we had a normal birth, so it was an option to do that. We're still like very pro vaccination, and so it's always funny like having those conversations with the medical system where it's like we're having a home birth and they're like, how do you feel about vaccines? And we're like, all of them. And they're like, oh, thank goodness, and so we have like those kinds of I would say like in our household there's a certain thing where it's like, oh well, we do this and we do this, and they're kind of like not particularly socially in the same bucket, right? Like you wouldn't expect someone to have a home birth to be, in this way. So there's a lot of stereotypes that I feel like, especially with children, that we don't have a lot of screen time, but we're not anti-screen. It's just
Yeah,
we have a lot of fun doing other things, right?
yeah,
Walking, biking, getting outside, reading.
yeah,
I mean, the amount of books that we get from the library is just overwhelming and all consuming. So I like can't wait until like I've never read Harry Potter, never read Lord of the Rings. I've never watched really a lot of the Star Wars movies. I was more like a Star Trek Next Generation kind of person. So there's like
you're a
all these
Trek.
things. So there's like there's all these things that I'm really looking forward to as a parent to like relive part of my childhood that I feel like I missed in a lot of ways, which could also like be dangerous if it
Yeah,
is like taken to an extreme. So I'm not sure. I mean, we have a drone, but we don't really fly it with the kids because we don't want that to be like a big deal. Yeah, it, it's an interesting balance, and I'm not sure what the answers are. I don't think there are answers. I think
yeah.
I think you can raise children with
By the
in
way, just
very
on the Trekkie Star Wars thing,
yes.
there's a very funny, underrated, probably not very popular movie, but it was about these four guys. One of the friend group has cancer, and they're trying to get him out to George Lucas's ranch to see like the new Star Wars before it's released, and they're battling Trekkies the entire way because the Trekkies are trying to. It's very, if you're into nerdy kind of stuff, it's very funny.
Yeah.
So it's very pro Star Wars though. So if you're a Trekkie, you're kind of the villain in the movie, but.
Please put it in the show notes and we'll take a look.
Yeah, there you go. Absolutely, I'll find it. Yeah.
Oh.
No, it's awesome. Yeah, and so you're kind of growing up, and obviously, I think the thing that there's a common thread, Mark, and I think you would kind of see this from a lot of people you talk to, is a lot of them grew up. I wouldn't say under rough circumstances. That's not the right, but they grew up having to work and invent things and be creative and find ways to develop, right? And they also had that natural curiosity, and I think that's super awesome. And you have to want to fix stuff, right? You like to help, right? A lot of people like to fix stuff and make it better. And sorry, Mark, you look like you're going to say something.
Well, I was going to say, and we've had a couple who actually didn't grow up under that circumstance, but what they concluded was like they just weren't happy, right? They were like, I was just like, I was doing my thing and plugging along, and I just, I saw my entrepreneurial spouse or friends, and I was like, why do they love what they do? Why, like, and I think it was because they weren't able to use that creativity inside of them, right? They were just kind of, they were pencil pushers and following the system, right? Do this, saving their 401k.
And I would think we would define, and Caylan, you might agree with this, but a lot of people hear creativity and think of like art and drawing and all that kind of stuff. But there's, creativity on lots of levels, whether it's writing computer code or, splitting wood and stacking it or building things. And, there's definitely different phases of creativity. I know for me personally, like I cannot draw to save my life and I have terrible handwriting, but I really like to cook, right? Like, and I always tell you that's my creative outlet, right? And that's a way to, and I think sometimes people think that they're not creative because they're a mechanic, and you're like, no, dude, I've seen you work on stuff. Like, those are works of art. Like, what you did with that engine is mind blowing. I could not do that. So, developing some of those maybe different definitions of what creativity is.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you would consider yourself a pretty creative person, right, Caylan? And, you probably you don't draw probably. I mean, maybe you do, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. My mother was incredibly artistic and painted murals across our entire house. She was a interior decorator, you could say. Um, and so when I look at the different qualities that I inherited from my parents, either nurture or nature, my father being analytical and with some business sense, and my mother with the ability to talk to anybody and have that creative spirit, those came together to form a very left-handed child, me, that took a lot of those things. With what's fascinating to me is like, if my mom were still alive, I would be a completely different person, and that person may not be someone that I would aspire to be. And the reason that I think that might be the case would be that my mother and I were so similar that we probably would have argued and disagreed. And she probably would have tried to control a little bit more of like where I ended up, but maybe
Sure.
not. She may have voted for different presidents than I, but maybe not. Unknown. There are some like really deep questions about like what life would be like if she were still alive.
Yeah.
And I am happy to experience like this universe that I live in, so like for what it is. And I think
Yeah.
that there's a deep like gratefulness for that sacrifice. I mean, there's another dimension where I died and she had to live, and it's like worst nightmare, right? And so in some ways
Right.
I feel like she died to let me live in some like ironic cringe way. Um but going back to uh post high school and going to, because I noticed we're at 44 minutes here, and I want
Yeah.
to
Oh
I
yeah.
want to make sure that we hit.
I'm telling you, this is episode 1 of like 15, so we're fine. We got.
So when I went to college, so I was 18. I remember in the summer of being 17 years old, my father brought me aside. This is a year after my mom had died, and he said, Caylan, you're 17, you're going to college in September, whenever kids go to college. Uh, you have your license, you have a job, you have a girlfriend. You don't need to tell me if you're coming home or not at night anymore. Like you're an adult. And I was like, "Oh my God." Like, okay. Like that was a pivotal moment, and from then on it was like I got to figure out how I'm doing this, Like he's got his thing, dad's got his thing, I've got my thing. And so when I went to college, I followed my high school sweetheart to the University of North Dakota. That relationship didn't last long, and I ended up almost immediately getting a job at like the housing office doing a website for them. It was like a content management system for their website, so it was all PHP. And a few months later, I interviewed for a position as a systems administrator, a student systems administrator that would be involved with like user management or something like that for the School of Aerospace. And at that time, the computer science department was underneath the School of Aerospace at UND. Um, I learned that I was like the second choice. So the first choice declined the offer to be a student systems administrator. I jumped at the opportunity, but like a little bit sore that I wasn't like chosen first. I was like, what was wrong with me that I wasn't, but it was one of the most amazing experiences. I had a manager that I became very close with and helped me avoid uh, like mortal mistakes in a professional environment, right? Like he'd pull me aside and say, "You can't say that." You just can't say that, And no matter what I said, it was just like, it's probably just speaking what was on my mind, and then I was like, "Oh, okay, I'll get fired if I say that." I think it revolved, for those curious, it revolved around like someone who had been there for a really long time that just like didn't know what they were doing, and I just called them out on it, and they were probably 50 years old, and my boss was like, mm-mm, like you're 19 years old, dude, like you're not doing that. I was probably 18. um I mean, just makes me cringe. So, but I credit this manager for being like so good at like shepherding me through like adulthood and learning how to be a professional in that environment. Um, so then I was at that job as a student systems administrator for like a year, and my immediate manager, whose name was Bob, got a job in Madison, Wisconsin, as a systems administrator. So there was this vacuum above me, and my the other gentleman said you should apply for Bob's position, and I thought, oh my God, well it's like the year 2001. The salary range was like 45 grand a year, full benefits. They'd pay for 2 classes a semester. I was like, this is a pretty easy decision. Well, I talked to my father. He said, you have the rest of your life to work. Don't start working right away. And I was like, yeah, but this is like what I was made to do. Like, this seems like such an obvious thing. So I took the job, and just flourished. It was amazing, and ended up getting recruited by the same firm in Madison, Wisconsin. So I went down there, basically doubling my salary and becoming like a traveling VMware Linux systems administrator. So I was in charge when they would go in to like a basement of a big insurance company. There would be 100 servers. There would be all these Windows servers, and there would be like 2 or 3 Linux machines. And so my team was like 20 people, and they were all like history majors, which is, I mean, it was like history and literature. And I was like the one computer science guy that knew Linux. So they would go in and virtualize all this Windows infrastructure, and my job was to virtualize the Linux infrastructure and bring it into VMware. And and so that was my job for a while, but I soon realized after like 2 years of that that I was gonna like end up in the suburbs with 2.1 children, and I was like, I can't, like I'm too. It just didn't like work in my brain. It was like too secure. So at the time, my spare time in Madison, Wisconsin, I was volunteering on different organic farms, like CSAs basically,
Yeah.
and so I would do what was called a worker share, where you work for 3 to 4 hours and then you get a box of produce that you'd bring home. So I didn't have to pay into it, and they weren't delivering it. I was biking out, 10 miles outside of Madison, getting dirty, and then biking home, um, on like a Thursday or Friday night or a Saturday or whenever. It was great. And then I decided that if it wasn't for computers, like what in the heck would I be doing with my life? Like, and it really like struck me that I wasn't like challenging my body at all. Like I was really challenging my mind, but like my body just wasn't like a part of the equation. And I started reading an author named Wendell Berry, who's a Christian agriculturalist, and he's still alive. He's in like his 90s. And I started reading some of his essays, and one was in like Harper's, and it was called like The Mind, the Body, and the Machine. Maybe it was like Feminism, the Body, and the Machine, but it was really talked about like what is your life worth? Like what does comfort mean? Like do we want air conditioned caskets eventually to like make us comfortable when we're like laying in the ground? Like there's just all these questions about like what is the true worth of human work, and it really like got me thinking. And growing up in a family that um we weren't religious, and which ended up like causing harm within like the grandparent family units and stuff. um Reading like a Christian author that I was like, I love this guy, like, and my boss at the time was like deeply Christian, and I was like very much atheist and like still am, but it like helped me heal that like familial, like what I felt was hurtful religious like smothering from like grandparents and stuff.
Sure.
So I was like becoming a more well-rounded like individual, and I thought I've got to quit computer work and I'm going to go live on a farm for a year. So I really started thinking that like I I worry about these like little computers that have like inputs and outputs that you can turn off and turn back on, and you can run programs on them and they do exactly what you say. But like the world and a farm is this like thing that has inputs and outputs that runs on a cycle of seasons, and you can't turn it off, and you get like 50 tries and then you're done. And I was like, this is like what I would be doing. I would be a farmer. Like I would be like a someone that's like intensively working on this. And I realized too that like on the computer side, it made liberal thinking and risk taking very much normalized. But in the agricultural sense, you have to be very conservative and minimize risks, because if you fail, like, what do you got?
Yeah.
And so that, like, that dichotomy and that, like, balance of, like, okay, I know what this is like, but I don't know what this is like, and trying to learn it. I struck out and tried to find a farm near Madison that I could live on for a year, and I found one that had draft horses, and I, like, really wanted to get into draft horses. For like, I'd never done 4-H or like anything with horses, and I was like, well, these things are incredible, machines for the farm. Um, and I did that for almost a whole season. They sold the farm. I didn't want to renew because they were moving further out into the country. And this was in Baraboo, Wisconsin. So it was right kind of in between Winona, which is southeastern Minnesota, and Madison, Wisconsin, which is central Wisconsin. And so I was basically in my car at the end of the season with, like, no home. And I was like, I don't know what to do. I don't have my degree, and I didn't finish it at the University of North Dakota because I was like 4 classes shy. So I called up this food co-op, which is like a small grocery store in North Dakota. And I had eaten, like, every meal there for the last, like, 2 years while I lived in North Dakota as a student and as a young professional in this systems administrator role. And I called up the co-op and I talked to the manager, who I was really close with. Her name was Betsy, and she was in her 50s at the time. And I said, is there a job up there? Can I just, like, come up and bake bread, like, something? And she's like, I'm sorry, there's no openings, and I'll let you know if there is. Well, the next day she called and said, we need you, we want you, please come up here. So I packed up the car and I drove up to North Dakota and started working at the food co-op. So I started in the kitchen, baking bread, making sandwiches and soup in the mornings, making like $10 an hour, and it was like the best job of my life. I just loved it. So I was, like, not on call, right? When the food was prepped and done, I was like, I'm out of here, had a full belly all the time. I helped start a housing cooperative, which is like a um, I just Google it. Like, a housing co-op can be really big, like a skyrise building, or it can be really small, where you basically, like, the nonprofit holds the house in, like, perpetuity, but then all the tenants are operating the nonprofit, so you're your own landlord.
Yeah.
There's different economic models to it. Um, Long story short, that did not last after I left, but while there, it was a very interesting opportunity. So then, I'm making sandwiches one morning, and I hear my coworker say, you should talk to our baker. He has a really good recipe for that. And I hear, "Meh, meh, 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 meh." And all of a sudden, this, like, beautiful redhead comes into the kitchen, and she's like, your coworker says that I need your recipe for Indian flatbread. And I said, yeah, the recipe's not that good, but I'll give it to you. And she was like, okay. And so she leaves, and the next day she comes back with the bread that she had made. She's like, hey, I thought you might want to try some. It's really good. And so that then became a relationship that is now my wife. So we met at the food co-op. Her name is Marcy, and she was in North Dakota uh, getting her MBA and law degree at the University of North Dakota. And so she was in a program to become a lawyer and get her MBA, kind of in a joint program, which was like a year longer than normal. And so we got to enjoy a few years there while she finished up school. At the same time, she's like, you really need to finish your degree. And I was like, eh. So I looked, and I had 4 classes left. I had history of women, Shakespeare, macroeconomics, and a writing course. And so I took them, and I got all A's, and it was a fantastic semester. But then what ended up bringing me to Winona was an interesting thing, because, and this is where label printers finally enters the picture. So at the food co-op, yes, I know, this is a long
no,
tale.
Hey, the classic non-bread recipe food co-op meet and greet. I mean, that's that's tale as old as time, my friend.
Does she? I want to know. Does she still use the recipe for the naan? Do you guys still eat it, or is it long gone?
It's the thing about. I mean, I can. That's episode 14, food, because bread is such an interesting thing, and a lot of the hobbies that I've had over the years that aren't computer related are very much focused on, like, process oriented things. So beer brewing, bread baking, fermentation, like all these different things, like sauerkrauts, kombucha, tempeh, like there's so many interesting, like where art meets science and where science can't reduce the art to something that it just becomes like, when you try to like grab it, it just like falls apart. Like you can't understand what makes these like beautiful things work until you scientifically reduce them. So there's that whole thing. But with the food co-op especially, they used a computer system that was running on these old Pentium machines that was running DOS, and it was like a blue screen, and it was used at the cash register, and it was used in the back room for accounting, and it was used in the deli for printing repack labels for, you know, raisins and stuff like that. And there were often bugs in the software that would be really frustrating for the management. And so I would say, well, I'll write the bug report because I'm technical, and I can see that it's an off by one indexing error. And if you touch the last one, it blows up, you know, like simple things. And so I'd write these bug reports, and after a half a dozen, this guy was like, "Who are you? You know, like, what are you doing at this co-op? Like, you obviously know what you're doing." And I said, "Well, I used to do Linux work, and then I did virtualization, and I was, you know, and now I'm just like hanging out at the food co-op in North Dakota, and life is good." And he's like, "Will you help us? Like, we really need to breathe new life into our system." And I'm like, "Oh, really?" Like, yeah, I think he might. Um, he's like, "We can't find these Pentium motherboards anymore," and this is like 2009, so not a long time ago, but it was like well past the era of DOS. And so he said, "Well, I'll pay you, you know, this much an hour to work remotely, and you can just kind of learn the system and learn the language." And I remember the first time he sent me the source code for the main menu, it was unintelligible. I could not. I was like, I know a couple languages, and I can't read this. And the reason was it was in a language called M, and it stood for mumps, and it was an old language that was created at like a Virginia VA, like West Virginia VA or something like that, and it's used throughout the medical industry. So over the course of its lifetime, it has morphed into what runs Epic systems. So like Epic is a big hospital technology medical provider, but this point of sale company um, used the original version running on DOS, and everything was like a serial port. You'd run a serial line to like a terminal, and then that terminal was like interacting with this like 4-port terminal thing on this server. And so my job was to modernize it, and I ended up using the DOS emulator in Linux to get this running, and had to do all kinds of funky things, such as hire a Russian hacker named Stan to add a bunch of ports, like virtual serial ports, to the DOS emulator to allow us to run emulated serial ports over SSH to these remote terminals that would then boot up and connect over SSH to this like server. So I would put out like, I would pay Stas was his name, Stanislav. Um, I would pay Stas, you know, $500 every couple weeks to like work on this thing for us. And I guess he maintained it at some point for the Russian military, maybe. I mean, this is all coming back and it's so pertinent now, but this was like 12 or 13 years ago. So Stas, if you're out there, thank you. What a wild world. So during this time, though, I kind of fast forward and jumped over it. In order for me to start working on this virtualization of their DOS system, I basically said, "I'm not moving to wherever you are." And he said, "Well, you really should. You know, what would it take?" And so I wrote a number down on a napkin, and he said, "Sure, come on down. If you can get it working at a food co-op, I'll pay you that amount." And the first thing I thought was, I should have wrote a bigger number. Because now I was like committed. I was committed to like moving to Winona, Minnesota, which is where I'm at. But my wife and I moved down here. Not that we were engaged at the time, and she got a job as a lawyer and in Winona, and passed her bar exam, and life was good. I ended up collecting the bounty for that work that I did on the point of sale system, and realized pretty quickly that that business was probably not for me long term. And so I
Yeah.
started striking out and doing my own consulting. And so I started learning again for like the 10th time, Mac programming development,
Mm-hmm.
and then started learning iOS development, mobile app
Yeah.
development. So this was like 2010. And I was at a local bar here. This was like 2012, and the guy was having a beer, and he was like, oh well, I work on these, like, I'm a firmware developer, which is like a person that writes the programs that go on like the microchips on the microcontrollers inside of
Yeah.
battery operated sensors and devices. He said, oh, I really wish, you would have given me your card a year ago, because my client was looking for an app developer. And I said, well, just give me a call if things change. So again, like the next week he calls and says they fired all of their developers. I think they were in Eastern Europe, and I can't remember if it was Ukraine or not, but it was a development firm in Eastern Europe, and they were having a heck of a time delivering. This customer of his was in Minneapolis. They were trying to get sensors and hardware to the developers so that they could test, and it was just they had to go through customs. It was cheaper to like buy a plane ticket for a person and having them carry it with them to like bring it to the developers, and they were like, "We're done with this." So he asked me, he said, hey, there's a trade show coming up for this client, and they really need these sensors working with an iOS app. Can you deliver? And I was like, this is the job I was made for. So I sat down. I worked like, I didn't have no kids at the time. So I worked, 20-hour days basically to get this thing going, proof of concept. And it was an app that's available on the App Store through my business's account called Smart Service Toolkit. And so this was an app to do like refrigeration calculations based on superheat and subcooling, which is a fancy word for like the boiling point of the refrigerant within an air conditioning or refrigeration system.
Yeah.
These are things that I had no idea about, but I had to like learn very quickly like what this stuff meant and how the calculations were performed. All I got was a spreadsheet, and they were like, make this into an app. And I'm like, okay. So I did my best. So then I did that client became like a big part of my consulting business, and we still have a relationship to this day, maintaining that app and like 10 other apps that we've written for Bluetooth sensors as well as like factory automation. And so with that, there was this is where now we get back into label printers. I was, it was like 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I thought, I have one really great client, but if they fire me, I need to find a real job, and I'm basically unemployable. And so I started thinking, what could I create that use my skill set, which was basically I take hardware that needs a really good interface, that's easy to use, and can I find like the best hardware on the planet that has like the worst software today? Like, where
Yeah.
is there a gap where I could provide a better solution?
Sure.
And at the time, I had done some work in the factory automation space to print labels, and I was familiar with how that worked because of the point of sale system. The DOS point of sale system used Zebra printers, and so I had familiarity. And I just thought, why are we still today like building factory automation systems using this like old code that the DOS system was using? That, I mean, why isn't there something easier? And why can't I print labels on my Mac using a Zebra printer? Like, why is it so tough to like design a barcode
Right.
label and print it? Like, you couldn't do it. And so
Yeah.
I set out on a like, it was probably a Friday night, and I was like, I'm gonna try to like build something that can print labels. And at the time, I was learning some new technology that allowed developers to write a program on the Mac and Windows at the same time called Electron. And so Electron is kind of a controversial technology in the sense that it's inefficient in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
but the inefficiency that the user is burdened with, which means like increased memory usage and increased CPU usage, the developer can program one program and run them on both Mac and Windows, which
Yeah.
gives me the unique ability to deliver a program to the world on their computer.
Right.
So that's kind of where Label Life comes in, is a side hustle that I created to basically learn some new technology that ended up spiraling out of control.
Well, that is a ton of background as to how we get to Label Life. I'm not going to lie, for about half the episode, my brain has just been like, I wonder what the universe would be like if he had stayed fixing the insurance industry, because that is still an absolute wreck. And anytime I have to deal with insurance, I just want to bash my, it's one of those like, all right, where's the sharpest pencil? Where's my jugular? Here we go. But
Caylan, those old Windows servers are still in the basement of insurance companies, and that's what they're running. I'm not kidding. That is still the thing.
Atrocious.
It's ridiculous. It is.
But we're going to get into a little bit more of Label Live. Now we know what led you to that. We're going to get into its applications and where you see this going. And I know when we talked previously, you said, hey, there's lots of directions we can go with what I've been working with. So we're going to head into the speed round, and then we'll wrap up here. So for the speed round, first question is, if you could go back and give 8-year-old Caylan one piece of advice, what would it be?
I grew up with a massive overbite, and like I said, parents put food on the table, but it was like I was brutally made fun of for much of my childhood. And I would say, as an 8-year-old, my mother would look at me and say, "Smile, you are so beautiful." And I'd be like, and she'd say, "Show me your teeth." And I'd be like, mm. And now I have a son who has an overbite, and it is the cutest thing ever. And I'm just like, dude, you're going to get it fixed, but just own that for as long as you can, because you are adorable.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Perfect. So this is off script, Mark. But for a speed round question, and you did work in the, in the concession stand state fair arena. So, was the money actually in the banana stand?
Yeah, isn't that funny?
Was the money in the banana stand?
Who sold frozen bananas?
When I watched that, I definitely have like my heart, just like nostalgic, like, oh, Michael. There's also been times where it's like I've done a very terrible thing. I made a huge mistake. One of the funny things, when you're dealing in that much cash-based transactions, there are so many pitfalls to hiring folks, and you would have these great days, and you would then look in the box and be like, where did the money go? And so I think the rationale for building, the point of sale system for it was like way ahead of its time. If I don't live by regrets much at all, but if I had any regret, it would be that, I joined when I went to school. I had that as like my invention, right? It was like, here's my invention entrepreneurship program. Here's what I've done. And I was like a part of a tech incubator in the early 2000s that tried to pair me with a more business focused person that could bring that to market. But the fact of the matter was, like, I was a naive, immature programmer, and the software that I developed barely worked, and it was not maintainable, and it needed a complete rewrite. And my heart wasn't in it to build something because I didn't want to compete. Like, people, even to this day, I got told 2 weeks ago, Caylan, you should really make a point of sale system. And I thought, I would never. I could never do that. And it's because it's just such a highly competitive market where there's lots of really good solutions.
Right. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I could go on and on about that, but there's a huge. I wish. I think it's important to say that, like, for entrepreneurs, like, you can have a great idea, but if your heart's not in it, it's really tough to make that work. Scott Galloway, who I mentioned earlier, has this thing where it's like the worst advice that entrepreneurs give other entrepreneurs and billionaires give entrepreneurs is follow your passion. And he's like, don't follow your passion. Do what you're good at.
Right.
If you can do what you're good at and get paid for it, you will have the time and money to follow your passion. But following your passion, like, that's a dangerous thing to start working on, because for one, there's no quicker way to turn a hobby into a very hateful relationship with that hobby than to make it a job and to make it something that you need to make work. And so I think, for me, my passions were puzzle solving, which means that, sometimes I joke that Label Live is like the colonoscopy of software. No one wants to deal with this, right? No one cares about label printing. No one wants to mess with this stuff. When they're done with it, they want to forget that it ever happened, and they're embarrassed that they even have to like work on this stuff.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so that's where I think that, my passion is not label printing at all. And I'll be the first to admit, like, I don't print labels really, unless I'm forced to. But I want to enable people to print labels.
Yeah. That's awesome.
That is, we had another guest who made the same point. He, his quote, which stuck in my head, was he's like, everyone's told to follow your passion. It's terrible advice. He's like, now we got a bunch of yahoos running around with a bunch of passion and no skill. Like, where's that going to get you, right? Like,
right,
full of passion, no skill. Best of luck.
Yeah,
and one out of a million people can make it work, but it's a tough road to haul.
Yeah.
All right, continue on the speed round. If you could acquire one skill tomorrow, what would it be?
I'm not a big gamer, but like RPGs or like role-playing games where you have like 100 credits and you have to divide them across like 10 different skill sets, and you can be like really strong, but you're not fast, or you can be fast, but you're not strong. Everything's a trade-off. I get asked often, like, what's the best label printer? And it's like, that's like asking what the best boat is. Are you a water skier, a fisherman? Are you out there to like, are you a tugboat? Like,
right, yeah,
what are you? Because
yeah,
you can do pretty much anything out of a canoe, but as soon as you put a motor on it, like you're specializing.
yeah,
And so with skills, I think that if I were more patient, which possibly some people might enjoy, like I wouldn't be able to get things done, or I wouldn't push myself as hard. So I feel like the balance that I've struck now is pretty okay, but I definitely have like survivorship bias in that argument.
Well, how about this? What random talent, right? Instead of skill, just like fun talent.
You can make better naan.
I think, like, I know how to play banjo really poorly, and I know like 3 songs. I know Wildwood Flower. I know She'll Be Coming Around the Mountain. And when I quit my job in Madison, my like full-time consulting gig, and moved back and started the food co-op, I had $10,000 saved up, and I figured it was enough to live on for like 6 months. And I went out and bought like $1,000 guitar, and it's like a nice left-handed Larrivee, which maybe I'm not even pronouncing it right because I don't play it. But if I could pick up a skill, it would probably be to like play the guitar like Jose Gonzalez. Jose.
No, Jose Gonzalez.
Right?
Yeah, he's good.
Yeah. And so like just to be able to like play Teardrop and sing it the way he does would be like a bucket list moment. And maybe when I'm like old and scraggly and I'm like, channeling the Massive Attack beat, that would be pretty fancy. But I think it would help soothe the inner fire that is the entrepreneurship, being able to play guitar.
All right, Mark, you got the last one.
All right, so if you got to go on an all expenses paid vacation, you got to bring one either celebrity or personal hero, where are you going and who are you taking?
Well, I would love to visit New Orleans, like with my deceased mother, because she partied really hard, and I think she would have a lot to teach me, and I think we'd probably get along in our older age. But looking back, she would be 72, so I'm not sure she'd be able to keep up with me. But maybe I wouldn't be able to keep up with her. It would be a blast, So I think if you've had any loss like in your life, like sometimes you have dreams about like the person that you lost a long time ago, and in the dreams they're like they've always been somewhere, but you just haven't been able to find them. And I think that really is such an intriguing idea, because everyone forgets everyone's name after a few generations, right? And I know that, yes, I'm like 50% mom and dad, but I'm 25% each of my grandparents, and I'm 12.5% each of my great grandparents, and I don't know any of them. And so even my voice or intonation or how I'm sitting, it's like, well, that was great grandma Landry on the other side, and she'd always have a cigarette in her hand, like smoking, and it's like, yeah, Yeah. Or they really like gin gimlets, and I'd be like, oh, that's obviously who I am. Those are my people. It's such an interesting thing to think about those celebrities and stuff like that. I was lucky enough when I was at the University of North Dakota as a systems administrator, I wrote scholarships, applied for scholarships to go to Apple's WWDC, or Worldwide Developers Conference. And so I got to see Steve Jobs on stage twice, and be like 10 rows out from him and watch him. And this was pre-iPhone. And so is something like, is Steve Jobs someone like that of a hero? And it's like, yes and no. If anything, like some of the interviews with Steve Jobs, like he says, the best thing in life that you can realize is that everyone that you look up to is no smarter than you.
Yeah.
Right? They're all going to have the same problems. Like, why is my toast burnt this morning? Why do I have a flat tire? Things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're all afflicted by the same things, and mortality as well. So I really have no desire for any like celebrities. I mean, you could probably like Wendell Berry. I'd be like, I named my son after you. It's like, and you'd be like, thank you. But that's where it's at.
Oh, all right,
Mark, wrap it up.
All right, well, thank you so much. I had an absolute blast on this episode. Very much so. Looking forward to next episode. Real quick, for all of our listeners, you can find links to go follow Caylan, learn a little bit more about his company in the show notes below, as we do with every episode. And then also, nothing we say can or should be taken as tax, legal, or financial advice. If anything sparked your interest on this episode, please seek legal or professional advice before making any decisions. Not that I think that's applicable to this episode per se, but just to cover our bases. Thank you so much, Caylan, for being on, and very excited for the next episode.
Great. Glad to be on. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.